pleasure to share with you this space that we hope will be of your complete pleasure to learn and share the experience with a panel of experts that will accompany us during the next hour. This is an event organized by the United States Embassy in Colombia in honor of Black History Month. This event is being broadcasted with the Spanish translation on the Embassy Facebook webpage and in English on YouTube. Let me introduce you the panel of experts, starting with Dr. Keisha Khan Perry and Dr. Paul Joseph Lopez Oro. I have the honor of moderating this space. Dr. Keisha Khan Perry is the Presidential Pen Compact Associate of Africana Studies at the University of Pennsylvania. Previously, she taught in Africana Studies in Brown University during the last 15 years. She writes on urban social movement fighting against the violence of forced displacement. She's the author of the prize-winning book, Black Women Against the Land Grab, The Fight for Racial Justice in Brazil. And Dr. Paul Joseph Lopez Oro teaches course on Black Latin American and US Black Latin social movement, Black diaspora theories, and ethnographies, and Black feminist queer theory. His research interests include Black politics in Latin America, the Caribbean, and the US Afro-Latinate, Black Latins, LGBTQ movement and performance, and Black transnationalism. He's working on his first book, manuscript, Hemispheric Black Indigenous, The Queer Politics of Self-Making, Garifuna, New York. Well, Dr. Keisha and Dr. Pablo, welcome again. And we would like to share with our public why is it still necessary to commemorate Black History Month. Dr. Keisha, the floor is yours. Would you please turn on your microphone, please? Thanks.
2 years of Zoom. Good afternoon, buenas tardes, boa tarde. It's an honor and privilege to participate in today's event with Dr. Pablo Lopez Oro. Thank you so much as well, Juan Carlos Velorio, for moderating this conversation. And of course, to Nicolas for the invitation to participate in this US Embassy event. I want to first begin by saying I'm in solidarity with all the peoples of the African diaspora throughout the Americas and worldwide. I'm also standing here in solidarity with the people of Colombia currently fighting for a more socially democratic and racially just country, and also in solidarity with the current presidential candidate, Francia Marquez Mina, who for me, whether she wins the election or not, really symbolizes hope for Black women in politics who are seeking positions of power, especially at the executive level of government. And of course, I'm standing in solidarity with the men and women who are seeking reunification with their children, having crossed over the US border, as well as the numerous who are incarcerated as a result of seeking a better life, entering into the United States, who are in essence incarcerated for being immigrants. So why is Black History Month still important today? Just like the Dia da Consciência Negra in Brazil, I think that Black History Month is still important because it recognizes the history and contributions of Black people in the United States. And if we think more globally, Black people in the construction of American more broadly speaking, nations, societies, and contributing to national culture and politics and social movements, et cetera. I think Black History Month is still important precisely because I think collectively we suffer from a certain kind of amnesia as it relates to Black people in the Americas. We still forget in terms of what kinds of contributions we've made over the last 500 years. We suffer from severe amnesia when it comes to the historical legacy of violence in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, from the trafficking in Africans on the African shore, the passage or the travesía from African continent to the Americans, and all the people lost on those slave ships. We still suffer from amnesia from all the people lost in the minas or the mines and the plantations, in working in households. We suffer from amnesia from the sexual violence. We suffer from amnesia from the police brutality that people currently experience, whether it be from the supposed war on drugs, the supposed war on poverty, the supposed war on activists across the Americas. Sometimes I remember that people like Martin Luther King were vilified members of American society. Martin Luther King was killed precisely because of what he believed. Claudia Jones was persecuted precisely for what she believed. And we have many more to remember. And as well as we can think about the Lelia Gonzalez's of the Americas who suffered early death because of doing the arduous work of activism and engaged in building Black movements throughout the Americas. So why is Black History Month still important? And why is it, I would add to that question and say, why is it important that we think more globally? Is because truly we're fighting one struggle. We are fighting one movement across the Americas for much more greater inequality, greater equality and participation in the societies where we belong. Without Black people, these societies would never be as great as they are today. There would be no Colombia, there'd be no Venezuela, there'd be no United States of America, there'd be no Brazil without the sweat and labor, the loss of land, as well as the violence that Indigenous people and Black people have suffered. So that's what Black History Month is really about. It's really about remembering who we are, where we came from, that we have collective histories and participate in collective struggles, and that we still need to continue to fight to get to a place where we need to get to in terms of equality and justice and living in more democratic societies. So thank you so much, Carlos, for that question. And I look forward to the conversation with Professor Lopez Oro.
Thank you, Dr. Keisha. Dr. Pablo Lopez, what do you think? Is this only an America commemoration? As Dr. Keisha mentioned some examples about the importance of some important Black people in our countries, not only in the United States. The floor is yours. Please turn over your.
Witi Rabuño, good afternoon, buenas tardes. I'm still kind of pinching myself in gratitude to share the same space with you all, especially Professor Keisha Khan Perry, who I have had deep admiration and respect for their brilliant scholarship. And anytime I get to be in front of a group of students, I am constantly teaching her brilliant work in scholarship and activism. I want to give a huge shout out of gratitude as well to Nicolas Barbosa, as well as you, Juan Carlos Viloria, for the opportunity to be in this space with you all, to be in conversation. You know, one thing that I do want to kind of position and think deeply about is hemispheric Blackness as really foundational to Black History Month. And I would actually push us to also think that the activism we see from Carter G. Woodson, the activism that we see from other African Americans, aren't necessarily interested in geopolitical borders, but are actually really interested in being in conversation, right? So when I think about the political and intellectual labor of Carter G. Woodson, he's in conversation with Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, right? So Arturo Alfonso Schomburg, who is a Black Puerto Rican, born in Puerto Rico, comes to New York City in the early 1900s and dedicates his entire political, social, and intellectual life to building an archive on Black life, Black culture that was always already foundationally hemispheric, diasporic, transnational. I do think that we continue to live in a particular moment where Black History Month is understood, right, within the geopolitical borders of the United States. And I think particularly the field of Africana studies, the field of Black studies has always really pushed us to think about Blackness with beyond this thing that Ronaldo Walcott calls the nation state thing, right? And I think the historical lessons that we have deeply learned as Black people throughout the diaspora is that nationalism actually wasn't necessarily a project that benefited Black people, right? And I think in particular, Black History Month is an opportunity to not only remember the diaspora, but to also remember how the diaspora and Blackness in particular and Black activism has always been beyond border nations, right? And those borders, and I think sometimes in particular, I remember this moment when I heard Dr. Perry in a previous talk about, and I share this a lot with students all the time, it's like, when you think historically about the archive of Blackness in the Americas, right? Well, the archive tells us that there were 10 times more, right, enslaved and free Africans that were brought from the continent to Latin America and into the Caribbean, right? And even though African Americans are a smaller Black community in the hemisphere, they're also the loudest, right, politically and socially. And that has a lot to do, obviously, with African Americans being in the belly, right, in the belly of US imperialism. But that also has a lot to do with how social movements, particularly Black social movements in the United States, have mobilized. So when I think about how El Mes de la Herencia Africana is even kind of understood in Central America, that's actually a really relatively new movement, right? The push to have comunidades negras in Central America recognize the contributions of Black people before the formation of the Republic is incredibly important.
Thank you, Dr. Pablo. Let me welcome to the people, to special welcome to the people who are joining us in this moment, this event organized by the United States Embassy in Colombia in honor of Black History Month. Our students from the Access Program in Barranquilla, students from the MLK program from other regions in Colombia and especially in Venezuela. My name is Juan Viloria. I'm the Vice President of a local NGO called Venezolanos in Barranquilla, but also the General Coordinator of a big coalition of Venezuelan NGOs in the diaspora. As Dr. Pablo mentioned, we have a big heritage of the African movement in our countries, in our Latin American countries. I would like to know, Dr. Keisha Khan, what is necessary to talk about migrants, migration, and diaspora when addressing Black identity?
Thank you so much for that question, Carlos. I thought a lot about the example of, and I'm gonna mess his name up, but I know him as Coach Flores from the Miami Dolphins, who recently sued the National Football Federation for racial discrimination in hiring practices, in hiring practices in terms of coaches. As we know, in the National Football Federation, and I think I'm pronouncing it right, the National Football League, sorry, National Football League, they only have, I think there was one Black coach of all the coaches, right? So when we see all the celebration of the LA Rams and all this, all the majority of the players are Black. There are no coaches, and this is really important, especially when we think of the coach as the intellectual head and architect of a sports federation, right? And we see that played out in football, in terms of soccer, throughout the world, whether it be in the Americas, and we see in Europe, where a lot of the players are Black and brown, but the coaches themselves. So I've mentioned Coach Flores, and I can't remember his first name, but I mentioned him because he is of
Brian Flores.
Brian Flores. He's of Honduran descent. And what I thought was really interesting in watching news sportscast on his case is that the Spanish-speaking journalist spoke about him as Hondureño, and the general journalist spoke about him as an African-American or Black American or Black coach in the United States. And I thought about why it was so difficult for the Spanish-speaking press to think about him as at the intersection of being Black and Honduran at the same time, right? And it was I'm telling you, I listened to a lot of Spanish-speaking radio, and no one mentioned him as a coach, a Black coach, right? They mentioned him as Hondureño, right? So I think this is really interesting because it speaks to a complete erasure, not just in terms of a very complex understanding of what it means for Black people to migrate and why they choose to migrate, that they are forgotten in the countries of origin, but they're also socially and economically marginalized, and they migrate, and their identity, a significant part of their identity as being African descendant and Black, is being erased and embraced under a collective umbrella as being Latino or Hondureño. And I think this is really important. And it's also important on the other side of things in terms of the activism around immigration to think about not just the vastness of immigration and who migrates, that there are a lot of not just what are, this melting pot of people who are migrating, but oftentimes the most socially and economically marginalized. And we know that in our countries, who tends to be most marginalized are Indigenous and Black people as well. And obviously a complex variation of what we understand as people who are poor. And we see that, for example, in Mexican migrants who describe their experiences as becoming Mexicans in the United States. They understand themselves as Indigenous people in their countries of origin. And when they come to the United States, they become Mexican. Some of them actually have to learn Spanish. So I think about that as it relates to Blackness and immigration and how identities are reshaped as a result of that process. And I also want to understand that immigrants themselves participate in that collective erasure, right? Because African Americans are understood collectively as the worst of the American society, even though they paved the way with their sweat, blood, and tears, with civil rights, with actually laying their lives on the lines, whether it be in the American Revolution or in the American Revolution, whether it be in the Civil War, whether it be in the Civil Rights Movement, that paved the way for more immigrants and Black people and Indigenous people to be able to migrate to this country, right? So I think, so that said, they're still understood as the worst in the society, and no one wants to be African American or associated with African American as they come to this country and their primary goal and aim is to ascend into society. Why would you want to associate with the worst of the society if you want to ascend? But collectively, they experience the violence the same. There's no race, there's no Hondureño in the carceral system, in the prison system. You are collectively Black or read as Black, depending on the color of your skin, right? The police does not read you as Hondureño, they read you as a Black man. The National Football League doesn't read you as Hondureño, they read you as a Black man. So I think that it's important for us to start to think about the complexities of our identities, but also the urgent need for forging solidarity across borders and understanding ourselves as one Black people, one African people, and that Blackness itself is constructed out of struggle. Blackness is not a biological identity, it's a collective identity of struggle. And we want people to be able to understand that. So I can keep going, but I'll let you ask the next question of Professor Lopez-Oro.
Thank you, Dr. Acacia Khan. And let me welcome also to our Access and Martin Luther King Fellows, and to everyone who is watching, thank you for joining us. Dr. Pablo Lopez, does this mean, as Dr. Acacia Khan mentioned, that Black identity is subject to national identity?
Of course. So to just build on Dr. Perry's comments, I mean, and I'm incredibly thrilled that Brian Flores is being brought into this conversation, particularly because he uses, right, both African-American political discourse in his lawsuit, right? He opens up the lawsuit with citing, Dr. Martin Luther King, right? And I think it's important to also acknowledge that he's a third generation Brooklynite of Garifuna Honduran descent from Brownsville, who in Spanish media tells reporter, I remember this moment where he's telling a Spanish reporter, I believe from Telemundo or Univision, that you're not going to have me speak Spanish, right? Not today, not at this moment, right? And I think what that really does, it also kind of disrupts this kind of category of Latinidad in the United States, right? The very existence of Brian Flores, the very existence of Gina Torres, the very existence of Celia Cruz, Roberto Clemente, Arturo Alfonso Schomburg. Like I can go through the list of Spanish-speaking Black people in the United States. They quite literally disrupt this category of Latinidad that really reinscribes mestizaje in the United States, right? So here's this Latinx subject that emerges, right, in the census, that emerges in the political mobilization of Spanish-speaking communities in the US, but it's also one that is racialized as non-Black, right? That in fact, there's still a need and urgency for an Afro-Latinx movement, right? Because it's not simply about visibility or shifting the paradigm, but it's also deeply to understand the hemispheric history of mestizaje, right? And I'm even thinking about this in a class that I teach around Latin America, Black Latin America's seminar, right? And I teach about how mestizaje, has a particular historical moment. But even after mestizaje, right? After the nation state is built, Honduras doesn't imagine itself as a Black country, right? Colombians have to literally assert their Blackness, Afro hyphen the nation state, right? So there's a tension between Blackness and the nation state. I would even argue hemispherically, right? Because even when I teach courses on Blackness, particularly around Black culture in the US, African Americans don't even gain citizenship, right? Like even thinking about the Treaty of Hidalgo, Guadalupe Hidalgo of 1848, Mexican Americans become citizens in this country before African Americans do, right? And I think it has, what's deeply foundational is the anti-Blackness of nationalism, right? The anti-Blackness of how the project of nationalism as a project of non-Blackness, as a project of anti-Blackness, and to a certain extent, right, to even kind of verbally cite the work of Julia Hooker, anti-Indigenous, right? Because the project here of mestizaje, the project of mestizo nationalism, is one that is still intact, right? So even though in Honduras, in Nicaragua, we have el mes de la herencia africana, el mes de la herencia negra, right? This is in the shadow of multiculturalism, right? That quite literally creates Black communities in Central America as folklores, right? As literally caricatures of the nation state, where you only talk about Black people when the World Cup is happening, right? But you don't talk about when Black people's land is literally being dispossessed every single day, right? And I think this is the urgency to really unpack the paradox of Blackness and nationalism, but also, Blackness is still a conundrum with Latinidad in the US, right? That in fact, Brian Flores is such a beautiful example, and I genuinely want to sit down at some moment and really process everything that I've kind of seen also on social media, is that, there's something interesting about, first of all, I love the fact that he refuses to speak Spanish publicly. Love that. Particularly as a third generation, right? Fifth, sixth generation New Yorkers aren't being forced by Telemundo to speak Spanish, right? But Brian Flores has to kind of check it off, right? And there's something about Brian Flores's Blackness, right? And being a dark-skinned Black man that he has to kind of acknowledge, kind of get this weird Latinx test, right? Are you really part of us, right? And then also in the US, right? US media, BET as well, right? Like Black newspapers, Black social media can only digest Brian Flores as African-American, right? And only African-American within the context of the US. I'm down for African-American from Canada all the way to Argentina, right? But we understand that the US media doesn't understand African-American within that borderless of the hemisphere, right? So there's something about how Brian Flores has to negotiate the contradictions at the same time, right? And there's something about those contradictions that always points to the anti-Blackness of nationalism, right? And the anti-Blackness of nationalism that has everything to do with the project of mestizaje, which, you know, Julia Hooker Works tells us that it travels really well, right? And it's quite literally intact, no matter if there's this multicultural shift, right? And we all know that Latin American and Caribbean countries have adopted a multicultural constitution with the hopes of integration, but simply also keeping mestizos in power too.
Thank you, Dr. Pablo. I really admire the view of both of you who are teaching us how the Black identity is a subject of national identity, because in my case, I'm son of migrants, Colombians who moved to Venezuela looking for better conditions. As you mentioned, not only the Black identity, but also the Latins are contributing to the progress and to the growth in our countries. For example, in our case, the migrants from Venezuela, we are not only seeking for protection in the host countries, we are showing that we can contribute to the growth, to the progress, to our communities, because we are professional, we are athletes, we are artists, we are making to this integration process more easy. And also talking about the Latin and also the Black identity, could you, Dr. Keisha Khan, mention what place has been given to the Black indigenous community in the United States?
Could you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by Black indigenous in terms of people who, there are Black indigenous who are communities that were formed in terms of a mixture of African descendants and indigenous populations from North America? And are you thinking about those indigenous Black folks, or are you thinking about Africans who were transported to the Americas as indigenous to the Americas? I mean, I think it's a very complicated identity. I mean, maybe you could clarify a little bit before I talk more. Do you want me to continue, or I could certainly talk more. I think, yeah, maybe if you could clarify for me, I think that would be helpful for me to understand what there's the Black, in how people understand themselves as Black and indigenous, for example, in Central America, with the Garifuna. There are Black and indigenous people like the Rastafari understand themselves as Black indigenous. They mobilize a language of indigeneity and understand that even indigeneity as it relates to time is also related to staking a particular claim to belong in these countries, right? So the reason why Rastafari claim to be indigenous is primarily because, and asserting a certain kind of African Blackness is because they're excluded, but they're not the same as the Arawak and the Taino from the Caribbean. So I don't know if you wanted to tell me a little bit more, Carlos, what you meant by indigenous in this context.
Thank you, Dr. Keisha Khan. We want to know, how do the from Black and indigenous people identify themselves?
How Black and indigenous people organize themselves?
Yes, identify themselves.
Okay. I might have to defer to Professor Lopez on that question. But the one thing I wanted to emphasize from what you said earlier are a couple of things, because there's a long struggle, even ongoing struggle around Black indigenous people in this country, people who understand themselves as Black and Native Americans, especially when you go to places like Rhode Island, Massachusetts, as well as in places like Virginia and other and South and North Carolina, et cetera. So there are multiple places throughout the United States where there's an ongoing struggle for Black people of African descent, making claims to indigeneity in this country as Native Americans, right? Very complex identities in much of the country, right? In terms of how people worked in solidarity, how people lived across and combined communities throughout the colonial period. So that's a very complex history that is very separate. I would say that's related to, but also very separate from an ongoing, a very robust, vibrant indigenous communities throughout North America that have not been completely eliminated by, as people oftentimes like to talk about. But I also wanted to talk and mention about that, and in relationship to Dr. Lopez Oro's previous point, that there's an ideological struggle going on, and why education and professors and investing in these kinds of projects and programs are so important. It takes a lot of effort for someone to ignore Black people in their country. It's an ideological project. It's a political project to decide that you refuse to acknowledge and teach about the fact that teachers say we can't do this work. It takes a lot of effort to ignore a significant segment of the population, right? In Brazil, for example, a conservative estimate is that Black people comprise approximately 54% of the population. That is approximately 54% of 200 million people. So over 100 million people in Brazil understand themselves as Black. For an education system, a political system, to completely ignore that takes a lot of effort. And the work that's being done is also it's a result of the ideological and political efforts of Black people to make sure that knowledge and history is taught, right? Nothing has been given to, in terms of ideas, has been given to Black people in the Americas. I think we have to keep in mind, I think for the students in the audience, that the reason why it's important to continue to do research in the archives and continue to write these histories, because over time, as we see in Argentina and Chile and places like Uruguay, is that over time, you can literally write people out of the collective history of those communities and nations, right? And you can teach in public schools and universities and never learn about African people and their participation in the nation. You can have students graduate and not know anything about the slave trade. There's an ideological war. There's a war over knowledge, which is tied to power, right? So I think that's really important. So why it's important that we support, for example, Black people who are seeking positions of power. Oftentimes people say, they'll never win. What is happening is that there's a young person, a young boy or girl, who then begins to imagine himself or herself or themselves as potentially gaining power in that, and having the capacity to lead, having the intellect to decide, what they say in Brazil, poder de decisão, right? The intellectual capacity to determine their own future, for self-determination. And that is why it is so important. And the reason why they diminish, for example, whether it be Blacks in politics at universities, is because of the fear that Blacks collectively will begin to imagine themselves as having the individual and collective capacity for self-determine, to lead themselves, right? So I think it's really important. If we think about also other historical moments, Carlos, when you mentioned that you were from Venezuela, that Haitians went to fight in Venezuela with the promise and demand that they free the people from Nueva Granada. So for example, the idea that we are deeply connected, that we have fought for each other's struggle, that we've inspired each other across the Americas, I think is also really important. So I think understanding that education is paramount and urgent, as well as understanding us as participate in a collective struggle, and that for journalists to decide that there's a separation between African Americans and Hondurans, or vice versa, I think is an ideological and a political move that has serious repercussions globally.
Thank you, Dr. Keisha Khan. And thank you to everyone who is watching. Alejandra says, Garifuna culture in Honduras is huge and rich in politics, music, food, is celebrated, but there is definitely more to do. Thank you for your comment, Alejandra. Dr. Pablo Lopez, where are Black community currently migrating to and from? And for you, what are the main problems in the reception of Black migrants in the Americas?
Oof, that is a question and a very um, both temporarily complicated question. I mean, I want to say that Black immigrants and Black folks are moving every single day in every corner of the Americas. Black folks in particular, and I do want to build on Dr. Perry's comments around Black indigeneity and the indigeneity of Black folks. I think it's important to also acknowledge that, one of the key interventions that Black Indigenous people and Black folks who understand their indigeneity to be about terrenos ancestrales, right? So I do want to acknowledge that Garifuna folks are a prime example of Indigenous Black folks in the Americas, but they're not unique to that, right? There are Indigenous Black people in Colombia, in Palenques, right? When Francia Marquez Minas talks about La Toma in Cauca, and, especially in her 2018 Goldman Prize, Environmental Prize speech, she literally says, nosotros somos indígenas a esta tierra, right? Fuimos traídos de África, right? Like that is a huge intervention, both politically and ontologically, about how do we understand Black people, right? And how do we understand, one of the things that I'm working through in my own work is to think about the Middle Passage as Indigenous groundings for Blackness in the Americas, right? That maroon Jamaicans, that Quilombos in Brazil, right? The Gullah, the Geechee, the Seminoles in the US South, right? That Black folks have been Indigenous because Black folks have literally worked the soil of the hemisphere, right? And have built the very fraught democracies that we continue to exist in, right? So I think it's important to talk about Black folks within an understanding of indigeneity, and to also acknowledge, right, that indigeneity and the notion of Blackness indigeneity is also that comes out of the work of like Zora Neale Hurston, right? The work of Toni Morrison, right? When Toni Morrison talks to us about African Americans being indigenous, right, to culture, and how African culture is indigenous to the Americas. I think that's an incredibly important intervention to constantly talk about. But the migration of Black folks, particularly into the United States within the US-Mexico border, I would say is one about invisibility, right? It's one about, Telemundo and Univision don't really cover them, don't really put them on the front cover, right? We don't get to see a Black Latin American child cry on the cover of Time magazine, right? And I think that has a lot to do with the racial politics of Latin America. I also think when we think about, once again, nationalism, and when we think about this project of nationalism, who gets to be the national subject? Well, the national subject gets to be a mestiza, right? Gets to be a mestizo, right? Whether they're indigenous or not, but is someone not of African descent, right? Is someone not visibly phenotypically of African descent, if that makes any sense, and not to essentialize or biologize Blackness. But I think it's important when we think about the invisibility of Black Latin American migrants still coming to this country, it's important to talk about why they're not being represented, why there isn't more coverage on that. But I also think there is a lot of visibility on the fact that, I want to say maybe 2-3 months ago, right, we saw these horrific images of Haitian migrants on the US-Mexico border, and we saw Border Patrol implement, right, the same technologies of racial terror that we historically have witnessed in our archives, right, during the plantation era. And I think it's quite haunting to see those images in the 21st century, right? And it actually really helps us to think about what Sadia Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery, right? And how the very social architecture of life is rooted in anti-Blackness in the Americas. But I also want to think about, even, specifically talking about Garifuna Central Americans, Mexico has become a very hostile second home for Garifunas, right? The anti-Blackness of Mexico and its citizens is one that Garifuna folks, particularly from Guatemala and Honduras, are experiencing on a daily basis as they're trying to make their journey to the U.S. And I want to think about, the U.S. is always not always the only place, right? Like the United States is just one of many places that Black immigrants move to, there hasn't been enough research done on the fact that Mexico has an incredibly large Garifuna Central American population and a Creole Central American population, right? Mexico becomes this place where if the US is not possible or the US-Mexico border is too deadly to cross, it becomes a home, right? It becomes a second home for a community that continues to experience Central American corruption, government corruption. Juan Orlando just literally finally got arrested, right? After years and years of being in charge of all of this corruption in Honduras, right? But I just think about, I want to complicate where we locate Black immigrants, right? I want to complicate the narrative of the US, but I also want to think about how in the US, Black immigrants, it doesn't still seem like the immigrant subject remains non-Black to me, right? Like no matter the representation and how about the project of visibility, there's still an urgency to think about immigration as not a Black issue, right? If that makes any sense. And there's also this kind of sociological imagination around the fact that Black immigrants, they're going to be fine because at some point they're going to be so Americanized, right? They're going to fold into African American culture. And I would argue that yes, right? The Brian Floreses of the world will fold into African American culture, but it's not a neatly tied bow, right? Like there's a lot of complexities in that folding in. And there's also a lot of xenophobia, right? That we should definitely talk about and talk about how Black immigrants experience xenophobia everywhere, right? And I'm thinking about Black South Americans, right? Particularly the community that I know really well of Black Colombians in Ecuador and in Bolivia, but also thinking about Black Brazilians in Argentina, right? And thinking about Black folks moving into spaces where Blackness is always seen as coming from the exterior, like never from the interior.
Thank you, Dr. Paulo. Let me go with you again, but I want to say hello to Samir, who say hi and also mention, I'm so proud to be a Mother Luther King scholar. Thank you, Samir, for your message. Dr. Paulo, what has and hasn't changed after the Black Lives Matter movement? Okay, again, what has and hasn't changed after the Black Lives Matter movement?
Oh, I'm happy to have an open dialogue about that. So what has changed about the Black Lives Matter movement and what hasn't? I mean, I think, the Black Lives Matter movement has made a lot of openings and a lot of disruptions, but I also think that a lot hasn't changed, if that makes any sense. I think structurally, the language of protest and the language of social movement has definitely benefited from BLM. There is I think very much, we wouldn't even have the language of defund the police without BLM. So I think socially and structurally, there's been a lot of changes in the ideologies and the practice of protest. But in terms of changes, right, this is a little bit where the pessimism steeps in, right? And thinking about how Black Lives Matter and its urgency to remember the value of Black life is still such an urgent project, right? That in fact, the very essence of Black History Month is about Black Lives Matter, right? And I feel like, to be quite honest, I can't see that project ever changing or ever finishing, right? And I don't want to sound like an Afro pessimist, but I also just deeply think that we continue to live in a world where anti-Blackness is the bedrock of all of our social relations and interactions, that even though BLM has been present, and I do also want to say that the language of BLM is not a 21st century project, right? That in fact, the very impulse of Black Lives Matter has been one from 1492, right? Like I would even argue kind of this temporal leap, right? Particularly because while I'm excited to also situate that history within the Midwest of the United States and to deeply think about the African-American community within that part of the country that doesn't get enough focus, right? There is something to think about how the Haitian Revolution was already a Black Lives Matter movement, right? Like how to think about these different Black social movements throughout time and space in the Americas have been part of that legacy and continue to build that legacy. I think also about I even think about Marcus Garvey, right? Like the Marcus Garvey we know isn't the Marcus Garvey that just shows up to Harlem, New York. Marcus Garvey spends years in Limon, Costa Rica, right? Some of the first UNIA or associations are in Central America's Caribbean coast. You know, Marcus Garvey leaves Jamaica, goes to Panama, goes to Costa Rica and builds solidarity in those spaces, right? He gets to Harlem after, you know, Central America's Caribbean coast. So I think it's important to think about BLM beyond a temporal restriction of the 21st century, but I also think there are changes, right? And I want to be optimistic and I want to be hopeful. I also do think that after BLM, we see these diversity, equity, inclusion things pop up in universities, pop up. You know, I remember the summer during and after George Floyd, right? The explosion of emails we all got in our inboxes from our institutions, from our neighbors, you know, from the big signs, the big rótulos in everybody's house, Black Lives Matter. Those are changes, right? I think the village is really different. It's change, but it's hard to see the change when Black death is still the norm, right? And it's hard to see the changes where Black communities, Black folks are still fighting for the right to even exist, to even breathe, right? To even be safe.
Thank you, Dr. Pablo. Dr. Keisha Khan, we are running out of time, but before we leave, one member of our audience asked, besides Black Lives Matter, what have been other solidarity movements and what have they achieved?
Thank you again, Professor Pablo, and thank you, Carlos, for your wonderful questions and insights. And thank you to the member of the audience for their question. I think for me, what I'm always interested in is looking historically, and I agree with Professor Lopez Oro that if we look historically at solidarity, always in existence, always happened in existence. So for example, that message, if you think about the rebellion, for example, of 1835, the Muslim rebellion of 1835 in Bahia, there are always echoes of what is going on in Haiti and its impact on, you know, and what's going on in the rest of the Americas, right? So there's always a tension. There's always ideas and messages being passed on the slave from the moments of capture on the slave ship. There are ideas always circulating about how Black people imagine themselves as free. So I think for me, as I agree with the previous ideas, that the Black Lives Matter movement and a preoccupation with Black lives, especially acknowledging their humanity, that part of the most important struggle in the Americas right now is to recognize us as human beings with thought, with the capacity to think and having history. I think the emphasis on history from, if you look at the works of W.B. Du Bois and others, the preoccupation with history is an understanding of us having selves, having been human beings before the transatlantic slave trade, right? That we are human beings who were trafficked, who were violated, and collect in egregious ways. So I think for me, the solidarity comes from looking at Haitians. There's a way that Haitians led a revolution, an American-wide revolution in the Americas, especially troubling and disrupting how Europeans understood themselves, including those deeply involved in Enlightenment in the Enlightenment movement, understand themselves in terms of the construction of the universal man or woman, right? I think those are revolutionary ideals that traveled around the Americas and around the world, but those ideas that also came from previous memories, whether it be bodily memories, memories in our minds about who we are as a people outside of capture and enslavement. So I think that's really something to think about. I think about in terms of present day solidarity movement. I think the Black Lives Matter movements have been pushed to think more globally in relationship to police abuse, for example, throughout the Americas. If you think about it, ideas and practices around stop and frisk were perfected on Brazilians, for example, before they became even commonplace in New York City, right? So stop and frisk, as we know, is very common throughout the Americas before it became part of policy and practice. When you look at the military dictatorships, when you look at the schools of the Americas, where top military officials from Colombia, Ecuador, Bolivia, et cetera, were well-trained and perfected practices and techniques on indigenous people, African descendants, on activists who were fighting for socially democratic societies in Latin America, that those ideas and practices then also are implemented in the United States context. So I think about a much more globalized understanding of what it means to be Black in relationship to structural violence. I think these are ways, I think these are pushing kind of Black Lives Matter movements and others in terms of thinking about solidarity movements. My own work is around the importance of land and housing. My argument always is that if we wait to find Black people lying in pools of blood, we'll never fully understand the vastness of the ways that they're experiencing state violence. So thinking about struggles over housing and dignified living, especially things like, and related to housing in territories such as clean running water, good public health, that these are key issues that concerns Black people throughout the Americas. So I want to end there by saying, thank you so much for your questions, and for those of you in the audience for your attention. And if anyone has any follow-up question, feel free to contact me via email. And I always want to reiterate that I stand in solidarity with those who have the courage to challenge the status quo, and in terms of how we understand the location and the position of Blacks, especially Black women in our societies. I firmly believe that more Black women, more Black people in general need to pursue positions of power, especially at the executive level, and to really challenge what we understand as having the position to the power and the position to determine our own collective futures in these societies. So the struggle is for recognition, but the struggle is also for real participation and leadership in our collective futures. So thank you so much, and thank you to the interpreter, Lina Rosas, and thank you again to Nicolas Barbosa for the invitation, and to members of the U.S. Embassy community, and of course to you again, Carlos, for your generosity and your wonderful questions.
Thank you, Dr. Keisha Khan Perry and Dr. Pablo Jose Lopez Oro for your insights, your wonderful insights. And we are pleased to have shared with all the audience this space. We invite you to follow the social network of the Embassy of the United States in Colombia and participate in the activity of your interest. Thank you very much. Good afternoon.